Number 1. The world's first nuclear disaster, Chalk River. On September 5, 1945, at a newly built facility on the banks of the Ottawa River in Canada, an experimental nuclear reactor was activated for the first time. The device was called ZEEP Zero Energy Experimental Pile. Although it produced only 1 watt of power, this was still the first self-sustaining nuclear reaction in history to occur outside the United States. This success paved the way for Canada to build its first large-scale nuclear reactor in less than a decade. However, at this very site, 9, Chalk River Laboratories, 2, the world's first nuclear meltdown would also take place. The design plans for Chalk River were drawn up in 1944, during the Second World War. At that time, scientists from the University of Montreal were conducting top-secret nuclear research in cooperation with their British and American colleagues. Their main goal was to study how nuclear technology could be applied for wartime purposes, both to generate energy and to develop nuclear weapons. In 1945, nuclear weapons were used in war for the first time. The 2 atomic bombs dropped by the United States on Hiroshima and Nagasaki caused unimaginable destruction and suffering, but also brought Japan's participation in the war to an end. When Chalk River officially began operations, the war had ended and research shifted toward harnessing nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. Although Chalk River continued for a time to supply plutonium to the United States for weapons use, the facility's main goal was to research peaceful applications of nuclear power. At that time, Chalk River was considered a highly modern facility. The entire area, known as the Research Campus, was carefully designed and maintained in excellent condition. Remote-controlled robots handled most of the dangerous work near the reactor core. All employees working with radioactive materials were continuously monitored medically and had their clothing checked regularly with radiation detectors. Inside the working areas, walls were scraped and repainted periodically to reduce the buildup of radioactive dust. Some buildings were even demolished and completely rebuilt when radiation levels exceeded safety limits. The reactor consisted of a sealed aluminum cylinder about 8 meters high and 3 meters in diameter, containing 175 vertical tubes, 163 for uranium fuel, and 12 for boron carbide-coated control rods. These control rods were essential for controlling the reaction. They could be automatically inserted or withdrawn by machine. The boron carbide absorbed neutrons, slowing or stopping the nuclear reaction. When enough rods were reinserted into the core, the reaction would stop. The reaction could also be controlled by heavy water, which slowed down neutrons and made them more reactive. When heavy water was drained from the reaction rate decreased. In addition, ordinary water circulated around the reactor for cooling. Hundreds of workers were trained to operate and ensure the safety of the reactor. Many lived in Deep River, a newly built residential town near the facility, with low rent, modern infrastructure, and many social activities. The town had numerous clubs, from wine tasting to snail observation, and was praised as a model community, suitable for the workforce of Canada's most advanced research establishment. On December 12, 1952, the nuclear reactor at Chalk River was being used for a series of experiments. The final test of the day required reducing the cooling water, which lowered the reactor's cooling capacity. During the test, an operator error caused 4 control rods to be withdrawn from the reactor. When cooling decreased and 4 rods were removed, the reactor's power output rose sharply. Alarms sounded throughout the facility. The supervisor quickly identified the problem and called the control room, giving urgent instructions to fix it and reinsert the control rods into the core. But in his haste, he misspoke, accidentally ordering the button to withdraw more control rods. He realized his mistake after only a few seconds and corrected it, but it was too late. The operator put down the phone and immediately pressed the button, causing even more control rods to be withdrawn. The situation was out of control. Part of the reactor core melted. The molten uranium fuel contaminated the cooling system, leaking millions of liters of radioactive water into the basement. All attempts to reinsert the control rods failed. After more than a minute of chaos, workers drained all the heavy water from the reactor, stopping the reaction. But the damage was already done. They were now facing a damaged reactor, a massive amount of radioactive water, and a nuclear accident that had never occurred before in history. Cleanup efforts lasted more than a year, involving nearly 800 workers. A special pipeline was built to discharge radioactive water through a sand filter system before it was released into a nearby creek. ensuring no radiation remained. The reactor had to be dismantled and buried, an extremely difficult task. Workers were allowed no more than 90 seconds near the core each time. A replica of the reactor was built at a training site where they practiced thoroughly before each shift, which often lasted just long enough to tighten a single bolt or move one component. Hundreds of plant workers and military personnel, including members of the United States Navy and Army, took part in the cleanup. Notably, among them was Jimmy Carter, then a naval lieutenant, who later became President of the United States. Despite facing countless difficulties, through patience and perseverance, the recovery teams finally dismantled, transported, and safely buried the entire reactor. Along with dozens of damaged fuel rods, residents living in Deep River quickly noticed that something unusual was happening at the plant, and rumors of a serious accident began to spread. However, the danger was downplayed when the media were invited to visit the facility just 2 days after the partial core meltdown. During the tour, reporters were assured that the risk they faced was no greater than crossing a busy street. Gradually, daily research work, the main activity at Chalk River, resumed. The facility continued to expand in the following years, and the world's first nuclear meltdown soon faded into obscurity. On May 24, 1958, some maintenance work was scheduled on a new, more powerful reactor that had been installed at Chalk River the previous year. Several damaged fuel rods needed to be removed. The work was done with a crane, moving the fuel rods into a cooling tank filled with water, then transferring them to a temporary storage pool. However, during the process, workers realized that the tank they were using was actually empty. When the crane operator tried to return the fuel rod to the reactor, it became stuck and caught fire. Radioactive dust and smoke filled the area, forcing all workers to evacuate. After reaching a safe distance, they regrouped and returned with buckets of sand. Even administrative staff joined in, carrying sandbags into the danger zone. They worked in 2-minute shifts to minimize radiation exposure, running along the high walkway and pouring sand over the burning fuel rod until the fire was completely extinguished. For the second time in 6 years, hundreds of workers had to deal with the aftermath of a nuclear accident. They worked in short shifts, each person staying no more than 10 minutes, to reduce exposure as much as possible. A massive workforce was required to complete the mission, each person risking their health to contribute small efforts to the large-scale cleanup operation. This time, the cleanup lasted about 6 months, involving 1,200 people. Afterward, Chalk River continued operations, with many procedural changes and safety improvements. Although a few minor incidents occurred in later years, there have been no serious accidents involving the reactor since the 1950s. The 2 accidents of the 1950s caused no immediate deaths, but many cleanup workers later suffered serious consequences. The cancer rate among this group was 4 times higher than that of the general population. Many tried to request compensation or benefits but were repeatedly rejected. It was not until the early 2000s that Canadian military personnel who had participated in the Chalk River cleanup received compensation of about 20,000 Canadian dollars as recognition for their efforts, and only in 2021 were civilian employees officially promised financial compensation for what they had endured. In 2005, the burial of radioactive materials from the 1952 accident was re-examined. Investigators discovered that some fuel rods had been buried in wooden containers, and over time the wood had decayed, leaving the fuel in direct contact with the soil. The carelessness in burial procedures at that time was considered a reflection of the limited understanding of nuclear accidents in the early period. All of the material was later excavated and moved to a safer storage site. Both the 1952 meltdown and the 1958 accident were among the first serious nuclear disasters in history, even though they are far less known than later incidents such as 3 Mile Island or the Windscale fire. But for those who worked tirelessly to clean up the radioactive contamination at Chalk River, they will forever remain unforgettable disasters. Number 2. The explosion at Westside Baptist Church. On the evening of May 1, 1950, the peace of the small town of Beatrice, Nebraska, was shattered by a deafening explosion. A fireball erupted in the night sky above the Westside Baptist Church, illuminating the entire neighborhood. The church steeple was torn apart by the blast, crashing down onto nearby power lines in a shower of bright sparks. The falling wires plunged the area into darkness, and as the roar faded, an eerie silence settled over the town. It was 7:27 p.m., and everyone in the neighborhood knew that the church's weekly choir practice was underway. None of them realized that many of their friends and relatives could be trapped beneath the smoking ruins of the destroyed building. In the 1950s, Beatrice was a small city of about 11,000 residents. It was home to many churches, including the West Side Baptist Church, located near the Big Blue River just outside the downtown area. The modest wooden structure had a devoted and active congregation, regularly gathering for services, Sunday school, and weekly choir rehearsals. Choir director Martha Paul had led the group for nearly 30 years, beginning in 1920. Over that time, members had come and gone, but Martha maintained the routine with remarkable consistency. She took pride in this and insisted that anyone wishing to sing in the choir must attend practice regularly. She was especially strict about punctuality. Rehearsals began at 7:30 p.m., but she required all members to arrive by 7:25. Almost everyone followed this rule faithfully. According to those who knew the choir, it was rare for anyone to miss a session. 2 people, and most arrived early. On the night of the explosion, 16 people were scheduled to attend. Reverend Walter Klempel planned to be there with his wife and daughter, as usual. Earlier that day, he had stopped by the church to light the furnace so the building would be warm and comfortable by evening. However, during dinner, his daughter accidentally spilled food on her dress. Wanting to look presentable, the family delayed their departure to wash and iron a new one. Because of this, the minister, his wife, and their 18-month-old daughter were running late. Lona Vandergrift, a high school student and usually the first to arrive, was working on a difficult geometry problem that night. She was close to finding the solution and didn't want to lose her train of thought, so she stayed a few extra minutes and ended up late as well. Another member, Herbert Kipp, was finishing a letter he wanted to mail that evening. Despite his mother's repeated reminders that he was going to be late, he insisted on completing it before leaving. He too arrived late. Sisters Royena and Sadie Estes left home early, but their car refused to start. Frustrated, they called their friend Lona Vandergrift for a ride once she finished her homework. Because Lona was already delayed, the sisters were late too. High school student Lucille Jones was captivated by a radio program airing that evening, This Is Your Life, featuring comedian and ventriloquist Edgar Bergen. Being a fan, she stayed to listen until the very end, causing her to run late. Her friend Dorothy Wood, who always accompanied her, was delayed as well. Mrs. Leonard Schuster, usually punctual, had stopped by her mother's house to help prepare for a missionary meeting. As a result, she and her young daughter Susan were also running behind schedule. Marilyn Paul, daughter of choir director Martha Paul, had fallen asleep after a long, tiring day. Her mother woke her at 7:15, and the two hurried to get ready, but they still left a few minutes late. Meanwhile, Harvey All was looking after his 2 young children and planned to bring them along. Distracted while talking and playing with them, he didn't notice the time. By the time he realized how late it was already too late to arrive on time. Finally, Joyce Black had no special reason for being late, only that it was a cold night and she didn't feel like leaving the house. Because she lived close to the church, she lingered until the last possible moment. Later, she would say that the only reason she was late that evening was just plain laziness. When she finally stepped outside, Joyce witnessed a sight she would never forget. The church, where she should have already been, erupted into a massive fireball. She froze, staring as burning debris rained down, pieces landing right at her feet. After collecting herself, she ran toward the wreckage of the flattened building, terrified that her fellow choir members had been buried beneath the burning rubble. Several nearby residents rushed over to help. The explosion shattered windows, shook rooftops, and cracked the walls of nearby houses. Residents were covered in glass and dust, and many could still feel the intense heat of the fireball as it rose into the sky. The blast was so powerful that some believed it had come from their own basements or backyards. As the neighbors gathered around the ruins of the church, they feared the worst. On any other Wednesday evening, at least a dozen people would have been inside. But to everyone's astonishment, witnesses and police confirmed that the choir members, who should have been there, had only just arrived after the explosion. One by one, they appeared and were accounted for. Then a remarkable truth emerged. Not a single person had been inside the church when it exploded. All 16 members, each delayed for completely different reasons, had been just a few minutes late, and those few minutes had saved their lives. A police investigation quickly determined that the explosion had been caused by a gas leak ignited by the church furnace. Two cracked sections of pipe were found near the building. Because the ground had been frozen, the leaking gas could not escape upward and instead traveled along the trench where the pipes were buried, seeping into the church. Gas gradually accumulated inside until it met a flame, triggering the powerful explosion. The church was completely destroyed, and several nearby homes were badly damaged. However, most of the repair costs were covered by insurance. The church was later rebuilt and still stands today. None of the choir members were injured, and even a passerby who suffered a heart attack after witnessing the blast made a full recovery. The event quickly attracted nationwide media attention. Many were astonished by the incredible coincidence that every choir member happened to be late for unrelated reasons. Some saw it as an act of divine intervention, while others questioned whether the choir had truly been as punctual as they claimed. A few skeptics suggested that the members might have colluded to collect insurance money, but no evidence ever supported such claims. Investigators concluded that it was simply a coincidence, one so extraordinary that it was almost impossible to believe. Yet for those who survived that night, none of them saw it as coincidence. They were certain they had witnessed a miracle. Number 3. The Lewisham train disaster. On December 4, 1957, London lay under a blanket of dense fog. Visibility was nearly zero, plunging the railway system into chaos. Trains were delayed, cancelled, or rerouted. Many ran out of sequence as thousands of passengers, arms full of Christmas gifts, struggled to get home. As confusion deepened, every condition aligned for what would become one of the worst railway disasters in British history. The mid-20th century was a difficult era for Britain's railways. After the network had been deliberately targeted and heavily damaged by German air raids during the Second World War, the Labour government nationalised the system, creating the British Transport Commission to oversee the newly formed British Railways, later known as British Rail. Repairing the system was an enormous undertaking, made even harder by the urgent need to modernize. Steam locomotives, which had dominated before the war, were inefficient, costly to maintain, and heavily polluting. They were gradually replaced with diesel and electric engines, but this transition required massive funding and a skilled workforce, both scarce in post-war Britain. At the same time, automobiles were becoming more affordable and widespread, reducing the public's reliance on trains. A catastrophic accident in 1952 had already shown how badly modernization was needed. 3 trains collided at Harrow and Wealdstone Station, killing 112 people and injuring 340 others. The Ministry of Transport's report identified the limitations of the semaphore signaling system, which was difficult to see in fog and relied heavily on the driver's concentration. In that case, a single moment of inattention had caused one of the deadliest rail disasters in the nation's history. At the time, British Railways was developing a new technology called the Automatic Warning System, AWS, designed to automatically apply the brakes if a driver failed to react to a caution or danger signal. If it had been in place earlier, it might have prevented the Harrow and Wealdstone tragedy. Implementing AWS was a top priority, but progress took time. The busiest lines were upgraded first, particularly those still using manual flag or color light signals. By late 1957, many stations around London still had no AWS protection and relied entirely on color signals, MSCU, meaning drivers had to spot the light's color themselves to determine whether the track ahead was clear. That afternoon, December 4th, the fog thickened over London. As people finished work or Christmas shopping, they crowded into stations across the city, eager to get home. The 5:18 p.m. train from Charing Cross to Hayes, made up of 10 cars, carried nearly 1,500 passengers. Every seat was taken, and the aisles and gangways were packed. It was a relatively modern electric multiple unit, EMU. Due to the confusion in scheduling, the train left 30 minutes late, departing Charing Cross at 5:48. It was one of many trains running out of order, forcing signalmen to work frantically to manage the growing congestion. As the train approached Street Johns, near Lewisham, the on-duty signalman became confused. He had just cleared a Hastings service to proceed toward Parks Bridge Junction, but when he phoned his colleague, he mistakenly referred to it as the Hayes train. With the fog so dense, neither signalman could clearly see which train was where, and both looked remarkably similar. While they tried to sort out the situation, they decided to hold the Hayes train in place and signaled it to stop until they could confirm its position by telephone. Behind it, on the same track, was a steam train from Cannon Street to Ramsgate, part of the Battle of Britain class, named Spitfire. These engines had been built to meet the post-war demand for mixed freight and passenger service. The Ramsgate train departed Cannon Street at 6:08 p.m., carrying about 700 passengers. Initially, it passed several green signals, indicating a clear route as it headed toward Parks Bridge Junction. Then everything began to unravel. While the Hayes train stood still at the junction, the signalman tried to protect it by setting the preceding signals to amber and red. The Spitfire was driven by William John True, seated on the left-hand side, standard for steam locomotives, RMD, while his fireman, C.D. Hoare, tended the boiler on the right. The color light signals, however, were also positioned on the right-hand side of the track. The locomotive passed 2 amber signals without slowing down. When Hoare finally spotted the red signal ahead, he shouted a warning. True pulled the emergency brake when it was too late. The final signal stood only about 130 meters from the junction, far too close to stop a train moving at roughly 30 miles per hour. At 6:18 p.m., the Spitfire slammed into the rear of the stationary Hayes EMU. The crew of the Hayes train had just applied the brakes during their radio exchange with the signal box, meaning the collision hit with full force. The rear cars were crushed in place, the forward coaches telescoping into one another. At the same moment, the Spitfire's leading engine derailed and struck the base of a steel overpass. The bridge collapsed, crashing down onto the wreckage below. A third train, approaching from the opposite direction, managed to stop just in time, its front coach resting precariously on the remaining edge of the bridge but miraculously not falling into the debris beneath. Rescue teams arrived within minutes. Police, firefighters, paramedics, and local residents all joined in. One neighbor, Henry Chadwick, who lived nearby, rushed from his home to help. Small and wiry, he was able to crawl into crushed compartments that others could not reach. All through the night, Chadwick worked his way through the twisted carriages, comforting survivors, administering pain relief, and helping pull victims to safety. When rescue operations finally ended, 89 people were confirmed dead at the scene, and 1 more died later in hospital, making 90 fatalities in total. It was the 3rd deadliest rail accident in British history at that time. In the aftermath, an official investigation began. The coroner's jury initially attributed the deaths to gross negligence, but the coroner himself dismissed that finding, ruling the event an accident. The government's final report placed ultimate responsibility on the steam locomotive's driver, William True. True, 62 years old, was seriously injured and hospitalized. He survived but suffered severe psychological trauma and was unable to give testimony until January 10, 1958. His statements were considered confused and contradictory. He could not explain why he had not asked his firemen to monitor the signals, a standard safety practice at the time. True was a highly experienced and capable engineer, with 45 years in the railway service. He had driven that exact route many times, most recently just 2 days before the crash. The report concluded that he likely assumed the signal ahead was clear, even though his line of sight had been obscured by the locomotive's position. The accident was the result of human error, USEU, but improvements in safety technology could have prevented the loss of 90 lives. True was charged with manslaughter, but the jury failed to reach a verdict. In a second trial, he was acquitted. After the disaster, the rollout of the Automatic Warning System, AWS, was accelerated, though it would take decades before it covered the entire British rail network. For the families of the 90 people who never returned home that cold December evening, after a long day of work or Christmas shopping, modernization came far too late. Their lives, from that moment on, would never be the same again. Number 4. The USS Akron accident. On April 4, 1933, one of the largest flying machines in the world, 2 USS Akron, NIC, inched through dense fog off the coast of New Jersey. Entering a pocket of turbulent air, the ship began to descend, dropping rapidly toward the ocean below. The captain ordered tons of water ballast dumped, cascading into the air beneath the ship. The giant airship steadied, but only for a moment. Suspended above a storm-tossed Atlantic, the USS Akron was now only minutes away from total disaster. Airships had been widely used during the First World War. Both the Central Powers and the Allies employed them for reconnaissance, and later for limited bombing runs. Though slower than airplanes, airships could avoid being shot down by flying at much higher altitudes and could carry substantial payloads. Still, bombing from such heights rarely hit its target. By 1917, all sides had abandoned the idea of frontline airship warfare, though the craft retained important roles in cargo transport, scouting, and occasional experimental bombing. After the war, airships proved they could not compete with airplanes in direct combat, but their technology had advanced enough that many nations recognized their potential value and wanted to continue investing. The United States was among them, though its airship program had a rough start. The first, DN-1, was destroyed shortly after delivery when a storm tore it from its moorings. The United States then attempted to purchase Britain's R-38, which exploded during a test flight before it could be handed over. Those early failures eventually gave way to progress. The United States built the USS Shenandoah, which made its first flight in 1923. It was so large that, upon completion, it held nearly the entire world's supply of helium. Not long after, the USS Los Angeles entered service, drawing on the same helium reserve. The two could only fly in rotation. Los Angeles could take off only after Shenandoah had landed. Shenandoah later crashed, while Los Angeles operated for nearly a decade, providing the U.S. Navy with valuable data and experience. These successes spurred further research and strengthened the conviction that airships warranted continued investment. In 1931, the USS Akron was completed in Akron, Ohio, MMA becoming the world's first flying aircraft carrier. Filled with helium and stretching to 239 meters in length, it was the largest aircraft ever built at the time. The Akron could carry several light F-9C Sparrowhawk fighters, which could launch from and recover to the airship in flight using a specialized trapeze system. Despite its ambitious design, the Akron suffered numerous problems. One was the so-called spy basket, ARM, a small gondola lowered on a cable beneath the clouds, allowing an observer to see the ground while the airship remained hidden above. In its first unmanned test, the basket began to swing violently, reaching an angle near 180 degrees under the hull. The motion destabilized the ship and could have flung any occupant to their death. It was eventually reeled in safely, and the idea was abandoned. On May 11, 1932, the Akron arrived at Camp Kearney in San Diego. Dozens of sailors stood ready on the ground to handle the mooring lines. Though they were accustomed to working in teams, none had been specially trained for airship handling. As the Akron descended, one line was secured, but before the others could be attached, the ship suddenly began to rise. Low on fuel, it had grown significantly lighter, and the morning sun warmed the envelope, expanding the helium and increasing lift. At first, the sailors tried to hold on, but the pull was too great. To prevent the ship from pitching forward and crashing, they were forced to cut the only mooring line that had been secured. The moment it was cut, the Akron shot skyward. Most sailors let go immediately, but 4 hesitated and were lifted into the air. One released at a low height, fell from about 4.5 meters, broke his arm, and survived. The remaining 3 were hauled up so quickly that a fall would be fatal. On the ground, shipmates shouted for them to hold tight, and they did. But 2 eventually lost their grip and fell to their deaths. The last, apprentice seaman C.M. Cowart, managed to lash the line around himself. After nearly an hour dangling in midair, he was pulled aboard and survived. In a later interview, Cowart said, "I just hung on. I saw the others fall. It was terrible, but there was nothing I could do except hold on tighter." The incident was captured on film, and images of men hanging from the lines appeared in newspapers nationwide, shocking the public. Some sailors began to believe the Akron was cursed. That feeling only grew as the ship suffered repeated minor mishaps and weather damage on several flights, especially in storms. None, however, compared to what happened on April 4, 1933. In the early hours of that morning, the Akron flew along the New Jersey coast through heavy fog. Conditions deteriorated rapidly. Driving rain and strong winds battered the hull, and the crew could see almost nothing. After severe turbulence, the ship fell out of control, briefly stabilizing only when ballast was released. Moments later, it began to drop again, until its tail struck the surface of the Atlantic. Water flooded in. Despite the crew's efforts, it was too late. The bow pitched up and the USS Akron slipped beneath the sea. The crew of the German merchant ship Phoebus witnessed the crash, but, in the terrible weather, mistook it for an airplane. As the wreckage disappeared, they launched boats and rescued 4 men, one of whom later died. Among the 3 survivors was Richard "Lucky" Deal, who had narrowly escaped death in the USS Shenandoah crash in 1925 after a last-minute shift change. Now he had survived again, one of only 3 to escape from a ship carrying 76 crew members. It remains the deadliest airship accident in history, with a death toll roughly twice that of the famous Hindenburg explosion in 1937. When the bodies were recovered, many had not died from impact but from drowning, exhaustion, or hypothermia in the cold Atlantic. After the tragedy, U.S. airship crews were issued personal life vests. That measure saved 81 of 83 men when the Akron's sister ship, the USS Macon, went down in the Pacific a few years later. Even with improved safety, the Akron disaster dealt a devastating blow to the U.S. Navy's airship program, MA, especially because among the dead was Rear Admiral William Moffett, its most influential champion. His death effectively marked the end of the program. The U.S. military continued to use airships during the Second World War for reconnaissance, transport, and convoy escort. While ineffective for offensive combat, they proved useful for surveillance and protection. After the war, as airplanes became more advanced, airships gradually disappeared from American skies, symbols of a bygone era. The 1933 loss of the USS Akron remains, and likely will always remain, the deadliest airship accident in the history of aviation. Number 5. The Zacatone Sinkhole Accident. On April 6, 1994, 2 veteran cave divers, Jim Bowden and Sheck Exley, slipped beneath the clear blue waters of the Zacatone Sinkhole in northeastern Mexico. Their mission was to reach the bottom of one of the deepest water-filled sinkholes on Earth. The dive had been planned for months, some said for years, and tragically, only one of them would return alive. Sheck Exley began diving at 16. That same year, he made his first cave dive, an experience that would change his life forever. From that moment on, Sheck was captivated by the hidden world beneath the Earth's surface. He devoted himself to refining his skills, expanding his knowledge, and planning increasingly daring explorations. He became the first diver in history to log more than 100 cave dives, a milestone he reached at just 23. Over the course of his career, he completed around 4,000 dives, most of them technical or cave dives. His vast experience led him to write 2 books on the subject and to serve as the first chairman of the cave diving section of the National Speleological Society, NSS. Sheck also pioneered safety improvements that benefited the entire cave diving community, including the now standard practice of carrying a redundant backup air supply. Outside the water, Sheck was admired for his calm, humble demeanor. After working for a time at a car dealership, he became a high school math teacher in Florida, a job that allowed him to travel on weekends while still dedicating himself to his students. He was deeply respected, known for encouraging his pupils to call him if they ever needed help with homework. To many, he was both a beloved teacher and a legend in the diving world. Physically, Sheck was uniquely suited to the extremes of his passion. Over thousands of dives, others noticed that he seemed unusually resistant to nitrogen narcosis, a disorienting and dangerous effect that can impair divers at great depth. Yet his career was not without tragedy. In 1968, at just 19 years old, Sheck went freediving with his 16-year-old brother, Edward, at Wakulla Springs, Florida. The brothers had been competing to see who could dive deeper on a single breath. Because scuba gear was prohibited there, they relied entirely on lung capacity, L, and could reach depths of 50 feet. During one of these dives, Edward ran out of air before reaching the surface. Exhausted from repeated dives, Sheck sprinted to their car to retrieve an emergency air tank, but collapsed before he could use it. Another diver on site managed to bring Edward up using his own tank, but the boy was pronounced dead later that day. Edward's death devastated Sheck and shaped his lifelong commitment to diving safety. He often said that, though cave diving was in his blood and he could never give it up, he wanted to make it safer for everyone who followed. A few years later, in December 1970, Sheck served as a safety diver in the Bahamas during a record-depth air dive. Most professional divers avoid using ordinary compressed air at extreme depths because it can cause serious medical complications. Nitrogen narcosis and oxygen toxicity are among the many hazards of deep air diving. That day, Scheck descended to 466 feet before symptoms struck: confusion, dizziness, near unconsciousness. Thanks to his remarkable endurance, he made it safely back to the surface. Two other divers attempting the same record went deeper and never returned. The incident made Scheck wary of high-profile, sponsored dives. He warned others to avoid outside pressure and to be ready to abort any dive at the first sign of trouble. On April 6, 1994, Scheck Exley and Jim Bowden began their record attempt at the Zakatone cenote, assisted by a team of safety divers and technicians responsible for monitoring, staging equipment, and maintaining communications throughout the descent. Zakatone, a vast vertical limestone sinkhole ringed by steep rock walls, is named after the floating islands of Zakat grass drifting across its warm surface. Instead of climbing down the cliffs, Scheck and Jim entered through a smaller adjacent pool, swam through a short tunnel into the main shaft, and began their descent toward depths exceeding 1,000 feet below the surface. The two followed separate weighted guidelines, positioned only a short distance apart. When Jim reached 880 feet, he checked his gauges and realized in alarm that his gas supply was far lower than expected. He immediately began his ascent, a process that would take more than 9 hours, requiring multiple decompression stops to allow the gases in his body to safely dissipate. Skipping those stops could have caused decompression sickness, a potentially fatal condition triggered by ascending too quickly. The cause of Jim's rapid gas depletion was never determined. He may have been breathing slightly faster or deeper than planned, and even small variations can dramatically shorten a diver's available time. As Jim slowly made his way upward, a safety diver descended along Scheck's line to check on him. Had Scheck also consumed more gas than expected? And if so, why hadn't he turned back? The diver couldn't see him anywhere, only Scheck's waterproof dive record sheets, drifting upward through the water. It was immediately clear that something had gone terribly wrong. Within 20 minutes of the dive's start, everyone knew Scheck Exley was not coming back. His body was recovered days later when the support team returned to collect equipment. He was found intentionally wrapped in his descent line, too, something fellow divers believe he did consciously, realizing his fate to make recovery easier later. The exact cause of death remains uncertain. One plausible theory is that he suffered high-pressure nervous syndrome, HPNS, a neurological disorder triggered by rapid pressure changes that can cause trembling, nausea, disorientation, and cognitive confusion. While not instantly fatal, it can impair judgment, perhaps causing him to mismanage his breathing gas or lose awareness of his surroundings at depth. Other possibilities include an equipment failure or sudden blackout far below safe rescue limits. Scheck's funeral was held at Ortega Methodist Church in Jacksonville. Jim Bowden, who suffered mild decompression sickness, recovered fully and continued diving for years afterward. Today, Zakatone remains a site of scientific importance and a pilgrimage destination for divers. Scheck Exley will never again explore its depths, but his legacy endures. His passion, discipline, and lifetime dedication made cave diving safer for everyone who followed. Number 6. The sinking of the Lusitania. On May 1, 1915, the RMS Lusitania departed New York for Liverpool, England. The First World War had been underway for less than a year, and tension hung over the world. Yet amid that uncertainty, no one on the Lusitania's decks imagined their voyage would end abruptly and violently off the coast of Ireland, in an event later seen as a turning point in the history of the war. In the early 20th century, the ocean liner industry was fiercely competitive. Germany repeatedly launched fast, luxurious ships to serve the growing tide of migrants traveling from Europe to America. In 1897, the German liner Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse won the prestigious Blue Riband for the fastest Atlantic crossing, the first time Britain had ever lost the record. To stay competitive, Britain's Cunard Line signed an agreement with the British government, which financed the construction and operation of two entirely new passenger liners, Lusitania and Mauretania. There was one condition: if war broke out, the two ships were to be available to serve the government as auxiliary cruisers. The Lusitania was a true showpiece. Its interiors, designed by Scottish architect James Miller, emphasized grandeur and scale. The ship had 6 decks, with 2 reserved for first-class accommodations rivaling a top-tier hotel. Electric lighting, elevators, private baths, central heating, and decor featuring Corinthian columns, mahogany, and stained glass made it a symbol of luxury ahead of its time. At the same time, To meet its obligation to the British government, the ship was built with hidden spaces for transporting weapons and ammunition if needed. When the Lusitania sailed on its maiden voyage in 1907, 200,000 people gathered in Liverpool to witness the historic moment. It was hailed as a triumph not only for Cunard but for Britain itself. On only its second crossing, the Lusitania recaptured the Blue Riband, and from then on, it and its sister, the Mauretania, traded the title for years. When the First World War began in 1914, the British Admiralty listed the Lusitania as an armed auxiliary cruiser. In reality, it was not fitted with weapons and continued in commercial passenger service. Although demand for transatlantic travel had fallen, it remained sufficient to keep the ship operating. At the time, Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, also encouraged the liner to keep sailing, arguing, "The most important thing is to attract neutral shipping to our ports, particularly to draw the United States into opposition to Germany. The more ships that cross, the better, and if a few of them should run into trouble, so much the better." By early 1915, German U-boats were threatening sea lanes. Seeking to counter Britain's naval blockade, Germany declared the waters around Britain and Ireland a war zone and warned that any ship in the area could be attacked without prior notice, though they claimed they would try to avoid neutral vessels. Germany's embassy in the United States, fearing the consequences if a passenger ship were sunk, placed a large notice in several newspapers. Travelers intending to embark on an Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and her allies and Great Britain and her allies, that the war zone includes the waters adjacent to the British Isles, that, in accordance with formal notice given by the Imperial German government, vessels flying the flag of Great Britain or any of her allies are liable to destruction in those waters, and that travelers sailing in the war zone on such ships do so at their own risk. Some papers ran this warning right next to the advertisement for the Lusitania's voyage. Even so, 1,266 passengers and 696 crew boarded when the ship left Pier 54 in New York on May 1, 1915. Its 202nd Atlantic crossing. Most of the voyage was tense but uneventful. By May 7th, the ship was nearing its destination, moving along Ireland's southern coast about 18 kilometers off the old head of Kinsale. There, the Lusitania came under the sights of the German submarine U-20, commanded by Walter Schwieger. 2 days earlier, U-20 had stopped a small merchant ship in the same area, checking papers, allowing the crew to abandon ship, and then sinking it. This time, there was no warning. A torpedo streaked across the calm surface straight toward the Lusitania. A few passengers and crew on deck spotted the white wake and had time only to cry out before a violent explosion shuddered through the ship. The torpedo had struck the starboard side. The first blast was immediately followed by a second internal explosion, and the Lusitania heeled sharply. Inventor Robert Rankin, a passenger, later recalled, "The explosion sounded like a great peal of thunder, tearing through 5 decks, smashing the boiler rooms and the main steam line. A chaos of glass, wood, and everything else came raining down on us. About 200 feet aft of the point of impact. We rushed for shelter in the smoking room, and I never saw my companions again. Even until the disturbed, seeing car, even until we have seeing form, it's seeing telden for, seeing card, and lifing in the belongs place, seeing card, and life and from moment, and facted and from moment, with fact for, it was facted as life 5 math, seeing the crew struggled desperately to lower the lifeboats, but the list was so severe that the task was nearly impossible. On one side, boats slid across the deck, making it hard to embark passengers. On the other, boats canted inward and could not be lowered. Several capsized while being swung out, spilling their occupants into the sea. At least one fell onto a boat already in the water, crushing those inside. Of 48 lifeboats, only 6 were successfully launched. One passenger, Chrissy Aitken, managed to get into a boat. She later said, "There were about 40 of us in the boat. I feared it would capsize because it was overloaded, but fortunately it didn't. It's a scene I shall never forget, drifting past people crying out for help, and we could do nothing." Shortly after 2:30 p.m., in less than 20 minutes from the torpedo's launch, the ship disappeared beneath the waves. From the Irish coast, 9 rescue vessels rushed out to search for survivors, but the sinking had been too fast, too chaotic, too brutal. Despite prompt assistance, 1,195 people died, or most of them British citizens, including 128 Americans. The disaster sparked outrage around the world. Germany argued that the Lusitania was a British auxiliary cruiser and thus a legitimate target. The claim did nothing to ease the sense of injustice and anger, especially in the United States. President Woodrow Wilson faced immense public pressure to declare war immediately, but he held to his aim of seeking peace rather than intervention. Wilson demanded an apology from Germany, which never came. Germany's Grand Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz asserted that the Lusitania was an armed ship loaded with munitions. In fact, the ship carried no guns, but it did have munitions in its concealed holds under the agreement with the British government. The British chose not to disclose this. Public fury could be harnessed for the war effort, and admitting the cargo would have complicated matters significantly. In 1915, the United States was not yet ready for war, but the Lusitania tragedy traced a clear line toward its entry on the Allied side in 1917. After the sinking, Germany temporarily curtailed unrestricted submarine warfare, targeting only British vessels and avoiding passenger ships altogether. But in January 1917, when Berlin reinstated unrestricted attacks, that decision became one of the key reasons the United States went to war. Winston Churchill later said, "However terrible, we must regard the sinking of the Lusitania as a most important and favorable event for the Allies. Those innocent children who perished in the ocean struck a blow at German power greater than could have been done by the sacrifice of 100,000 soldiers in the field. Those who died aboard the Lusitania could not have known they would become part of the history of the First World War. Today, memorials to them stand in places such as Liverpool and Cove, where survivors were brought ashore. The loss of so many lives was one among countless tragedies of that war, therefore, but it was one that helped begin to turn the course of an era. And that is the story for today. Thank you for watching until the very end. If you enjoy videos like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel so that you receive a notification each time we release a new one. Time we release a new one. Time we release a new one. Time we release a new one.